later on in the presentation. And I also I'm involved with this organization called the People School of DC that does a lot of anti-racism education and things like that. So we'll talk a little bit about that as well. But I created this class about 2 years ago with the hopes of kind of bringing more intentionality to a lot of all these awesome, amazing projects in urban ag and food security happening in DC. You know, from farms and farmers markets to food access programs. It's a really exciting urban ag and food justice movement in DC. But a lot of times, you know, we get, you know, caught up in our own islands, our own projects, and we really, a lot of these projects have very strong focuses on just like the outcomes of a lot of these communities, which can be, you know, which is good, you know, like we look at a community and be like, oh, look at this community, it's food insecure, let's just get them some food, and then problem solved, you know. But in reality, I mean, we're never, you know, we need to take a deeper dive on what's bringing, you know, why is this community, you know, food insecure, you know, what are the environments, the histories, the systems that's causing this food insecurity, and then that's where we, need to, focus on that. I mean, not get me wrong. I mean, there's a lot of people are alive today because of focuses on outcomes and band-aids and things like that. And there's a lot of evil people trying to remove, you know, those band-aids. And we need to keep on meeting that need, you know, but at the same time, in our projects, we also need to take a deeper dive on understanding what is causing that need in the first place. And if we ever want to really, you know, fix these problems, we got, you know, look at the roots of these problems. Because you know, there are a lot of exciting projects. There's a lot of, you know, exciting farms and stuff that we're working on, but we just have this tendency to become these islands of sustainability and food justice, and kind of forget that we're operating in these larger systems of oppression throughout our country. You know, systems such as, you know, patriarchy and neoliberal capitalism and white supremacy. And when I talk about white supremacy, I'm not talking about white supremacists. So that is an outcome of white supremacy. It is white supremacists, the KKK, you know, white nationalism, things like that. But that's just one outcome of white supremacy. So is, you know, housing discrimination is another outcome. The racial wealth gap, you know, white, you know, households having 16 times as much wealth as black households is an outcome of white supremacy. Racism in our criminal justice system is an outcome of white supremacy. So we really need to, you know, kind of get past this, like, you know, definition that, you know, racism and white supremacy is just something that, you know, bad people do, you know, that that are intentional and they have bad hearts and all that stuff. And in reality, when I talk about white supremacy, I'm talking about automatic systems that operate, whether we want them to operate, whether we're aware of them, whether we agree with them, whether we think we're a part of them or not. These automatic systems that benefit white people culturally, politically, economically, socially, at the cost and oftentimes exploitation and disenfranchisement and marginalization of people of color. And these systems, they're going to happen regardless if you agree with them, regardless if you're on board with them, regardless if you're even aware they exist. For example, if you if you Google search, you know, beauty, you're going to see, you know, tons of, like, you know, pictures of, like, white people and white models. And if you Google criminal, you're going to see tons of pictures of you know, black people. And then that's going to happen whether you agree with it, whether you're on board with, on it, or, like I said, whether you're even aware of it. For example, like if we have tons of studies that really focus on job discrimination, you know, hiring discrimination. We have a lot of data on that, and we know that if we take two resumes, and we sent, you know, exact same resumes, but we put a white name on one resume and a black name on another resume, and we send those out, you know, we know from all the studies, you know, that have done this, all have the same results, you know, that we know that, you know, on the conservative end, you know, I've seen studies that say, you know, the white sounding name has a 2 to 3 times more, you know, better chance of getting a call back and getting an interview as a black sounding name. And that's on the conservative end. And I've seen it, you know, up to, like, you know, 10, 15, 20%, you know, better chance of getting a call back. And that's not necessarily because, you know, our HR departments are full of white supremacists and Klansmen and things like that. That's because they're full of, you know, white people, just like all the, you know, the rest of the white people, or like the rest of us who are born in a white supremacy country, and we absorb and we internalized a lot of that white supremacy through, our family, our friends, our community, our Eurocentric whitewashed, education, our media, we absorbed a lot of this to the point where, we just feel like that resume with a white sounding name just is a little bit more qualified, it's again, it's not about, you know, being, it's not about, good and bad, evil and right. It's about understanding these bigger systems of oppression, and trying to figure out, how we internalize those systems and how we absorb them and how they come out. So, and it could be overwhelming sometimes. Like if you grew up like I did, I grew up in a steel town in Ohio. I later recently found out it was actually a sundown town. It's a my entire world, growing up was white. All my friends were white. My community, my church was white. All my mentors were white. I was taught a Eurocentric, a white education. I was taught, this country's a meritocracy and all these things, and it was really difficult for me to kind of escape that. And really start seeing what was happening outside of my white segregated world. But a lot of this, and when we do that, we often feel like guilt and shame and things like that. And a lot of this isn't about shaming people. It's not about, especially not white guilt, because white guilt can actually, keep you from, being, trying to dismantle some of this stuff. A lot of this is about realizing we were all born into this, country. We were all born into these systems, and it's all, it's just about understanding these systems of oppression and then doing what you can to dismantle them and try to create a better world. So that's what we're really going to focus on. But we're going to focus on today. We're going to focus on. We could take this in a lot of different directions. We could do a whole class on, criminal justice system. We could, how that's affect food security. We could do a whole class on, the rise of the, political right in the 50s and 60s and how that's affected, food insecurity. But we're really just going to focus today. We're going to focus on spatial racism. We're going to focus on housing discrimination, segregation, gentrification, and things like that, and how these bigger systems are affecting the communities that we're working with today. Cool. So we'll go ahead. So if you can go ahead and try to mute yourself if you haven't already. WebEx is a little confusing because the mute button it has a slash through it, whether it's muted or not. You want to actually mute yourself. Make sure the mute button is red, and that should help you mute. Yeah, real confusing. That's I just put in one slide about what's happening today because I think it's important to kind of talk. There's a couple of things. I think there's a couple of really important takeaways I want to talk about what's happening with the uprisings that are happening across our country. But this is going to be the main slide that we actually talk about it, and then the rest of the presentation is more going to be about the histories of what led to this and what created these environments. But a couple of things I just want to kind of point out. Hopefully everyone's aware of what's happening right now with the murder of George Floyd, which activated protests, nationwide. I think I've heard like 75, cities are protesting right now. And hopefully, George Floyd was the spark, but hopefully people realizing that this is much bigger than George Floyd. And this is about centuries of systems of oppression that Black communities have had to deal with. So I wanted to kind of, just talk about a couple quick things before we dive into the presentation. One thing, it's really cool seeing like so many people that I've never really seen care so much about this are starting to care and are starting to be more activated and seeing like the hashtag Black Lives Matter, all over the place. And that's great. That's awesome. And at the same time, it's not enough just to kind of like, it's important that we amplify, what's happening, amplify, voices of color, leaders of color right now and what they're saying and what's happening. And at the same time, I think it's really important, specifically for white people, to understand the systems that are devaluing Black lives right now, are marginalizing and dehumanizing Black lives. Because it's not just enough about getting everyone to agree that Black lives matter. It's also about understanding the systems that don't, that automatically, devalue Black lives, from housing to racial wealth gap to gentrification, to all these different things happening. And particularly, I think a huge focus is on the criminal justice system right now, and how that, is handling. How that devalues Black people, and that's really important to understand, because there's a lot of we're struggling with a lot of narratives, about property loss right now, and it's important to understand that valuing property over Black lives, prioritizing your outrage on property instead of Black lives is a form of devaluing Black lives. Seen a lot of posts saying like, I care about Black people, I just care about and it's a mixed issue. It's tough. I'm not like justifying the property loss, but it's important that we have a hierarchy of what we value, and that we value Black lives. And we also understand that it's, police, like myself, I have friends that are police, I have family members that are police, and I grew up with these people. I know that, they want to make a difference, but at the same time, we have to understand this isn't about good cops and bad cops. This is about a fundamentally racist criminal justice system that has racist outcomes at every single aspect of it. If you're Black, you're disproportionately more likely to get pulled over, more likely to get arrested, to get brutalized, to get killed, more likely to be convicted by a jury that's more likely to be white, more likely to receive longer sentences, more likely to get a death penalty, more likely to have your appeals and paroles revoked. Every aspect of this system. There's just mountains of evidence right now that every aspect of this system produces racist results, and that's really important to understand. And even if there's good cops right now, they're trying to speak out. The whole system in itself is set up to prevent them from speaking out. I wrote a couple names down here, like the Joseph Crystal, Adrian Schoolcraft. I mean, these are all police that try to speak out against police brutality over the last couple decades. And it's just, if you look at the consequences for a police officer to actually speak up, it ranges from like harassment to missing promotions to loss of jobs to getting the bad shifts, not getting backup when you need backup, and even death. So there's whole systems that are preventing cops from even trying to oppose a lot of this police brutality. And then there's just this fundamental lack of accountability with police. Like generally, police themselves, and there's no registry for police shootings. They purge their discipline records pretty often. There's a thing called gypsy cops, where a cop will get fired for police brutality, and then within a month will be hired at a new place because there's no records that follow them. The cop that killed Tamir Rice was actually fired before. The department, fired him because he was emotionally unstable, and they felt like he was a danger. But then he immediately got hired. I think it was Cleveland, and then ended up killing Tamir Rice. Got fired for that, and then less than a year later, he got hired at another police department. So there's this fundamental, barriers to actually holding a lot of this police accountable. There's a really great speech on YouTube. It's about 10 minutes long, but it's really important. The Attorney General of Baltimore, Marilyn Mosby. So she, when Freddie Gray was murdered in Baltimore, she tried to prosecute the police for doing this. And it was a 10-minute clip where she just talks about just how impossible it is to actually prosecute police, and how many barriers there are to actually getting that conviction. And ultimately, she couldn't. And the narrative was that he snapped his own spine. And no one was responding. So it's. Watch that to really understand just how hard it is to actually hold accountability. And then John Oliver just did this amazing, we did this about a year ago, but it's an amazing clip on police accountability. It's like 20 minutes long, but check that out. You could just, YouTube it. And it really talks about all these barriers and how just hard it is to actually bring accountability to what's happening. And I think, I wrote this, I really like this quote. Jesse Williams gave this in 2016 BET Awards, where he talks about, I'll read the quote: "If you have a critique for the resistance, for our resistance, then you better have established record of critique for our oppression." And this is the idea that, all these people are suddenly having critiques on how, the Black community is resisting in the uprising. And that's really important to understand. yeah, you can't. I mean, it's like saying like calling Nat Turner a murderer without mentioning slavery. If you're having a critique and you're also not critiquing the systems that created these realities, then yeah, again, that's another form of devaluing Black lives. So there is a couple movements that are happening right now. There's two paths forward. Hopefully, we're going to be going on these two paths forward. But one of them is let's have a reform movement. And if you really want to understand how to reform police, check out Campaign Zero. It's a very thorough, very amazing organization. They have about a dozen different reforms that are essential to happen right now. And then if you also there's also an abolition movement about abolishing police, and that there's a lot of different perspectives on that, and there's a lot of misunderstanding. But for the most part, some people want to completely abolish them, but then for the most part, they don't want to completely abolish them. They want to greatly reduce the funding and the capacity of police and take that funding and start investing into the community. So instead of policing communities, they want to start investing in communities as a way of crime control. And then there's some really great information with the Marshall Project. It does a lot on prison abolition. So I definitely recommend. Cool. And definitely recommend you check that out. All right, so now we're going to move forward. I got a couple of things I want to highlight really quickly, and then we're going to jump into food apartheid. Sorry, it's just so much that's happening right now. So last year I did a introduction to racism and white privilege course. It was a 15-class course, multimedia lecture series that talked all about just different histories, mainly of white supremacy and things like that. So I'm working on turning all these courses into webinar series. That's hopefully going to happen next month. So if you're interested in receiving updates, definitely email peopleschool@dc for those updates. And then People's School of DC, if you're from DC and you want to get more involved with what's happening, a bunch of us started this organization called People's School, where it's there's so much amazing activism and initiatives happening in DC, but oftentimes they're happening on their own islands. So if you want to figure out all the different organizations that are working on anti-racism or homelessness or immigration reform and things like that, it's a whole resource website. And also, if you follow us on Facebook, we have tons of different kinds of events and activism, and there's so much happening in DC. So we have a big events calendar to check out. So if you're figuring out if you're struggling where to actually plug in or where to get involved, definitely follow us on Facebook. All right, and then so the People's School DC. At the same time, we also did a Kill COVID resource page. So if you're looking for different resources or different ways to get involved with COVID, check it out. But I'm gonna move on. All right, so COVID. And then the last couple of things. So we've really been, since COVID hit, we've really been a strong push on trying to build a lot of resources on urban gardening and start growing our own food. I think that people are realizing just the need to kind of grow their own food right now, not only to take less stress on our overstressed food systems, but also create more local systems, reduce trips to the grocery, and just kind of stay sane right now and during our social distancing. So definitely check out. We have over 30 different workshops right now. We converted all onto webinars. So if you're interested in figuring out, from basic to advanced, if you're interested in figuring out different ways to try growing your own food, definitely check it out. All right, so now we're going to, thank you for the intro. I didn't want to stir the pot too much, but I just wanted to address some things and talk about things that we're working on. And now we're going to jump into the presentation of Roots of Food Apartheid. Cool. So we're going to talk about three different things right now. We're going to talk about different frameworks of approaching different communities that are dealing with food insecurity, from idea of food deserts to the idea of food apartheids. We're going to kind of jump into what is food apartheids and all the different, and we're going to jump into the history, especially the history of the last century, and particularly focus on spatial racism and how that's produced a lot of these food insecure communities. And then we're going to talk about possible solutions. Cool. And then I want to definitely, so I think we're going to one. So Uh, I'm happy to keep on talking afterwards, especially if like some people are already trying to open up some big conversations. Let's hold off on those big conversations. I'm happy to talk to you all afterwards about the bigger ones. More, I'm really just focused on want to get through this content. So maybe we can save the chat for more just like specifics around the content we're about to present. But I also have this problem. A lot of times I talk about a lot of depressing things, and then I don't ever get to the actual solutions. So I'm going to remind me at 12:45. Wait, no, we go to 12:30. So remind me at 12:15. If we haven't got to the solutions part, I'm going to jump to the solutions so we can, the goal is not to like depress everyone, but to make them, motivate people and make them aware of all these different opportunities to kind of tap into. Cool. So food deserts versus food apartheid. So a while ago, I mean, this actually started. The definition of food deserts became popular started around the 70s and 80s, but really became popular in the last decade or so as the USDA started adopting this as a framework to kind of assess and analyze different levels of food insecurity around the country. So they created this framework, this definition of food deserts, where there's basically three criteria for food deserts. One is you need to have a community that doesn't have a full service grocery store within walking distance. Particularly walking distance is like about half mile or so. Two, you also need to have a lot of households that don't have, vehicle access and maybe not, have great, public transit. And then three, the median household income needs to be, below the poverty. So majority of people need to be living in the federal poverty level. So this worked out for a while, but then we start realizing that there was the more we analyzed it, we start realizing there was definitely a racial component to a lot of this food insecurity. We started realizing that people, I mean, like this is something, there's food deserts, everywhere in this country, rural, urban environments, cities and suburbs, but we started realizing that just disproportionately, people of color, particularly Black people, were more likely to be living in food deserts. And then at the same time, we started realizing that they were more likely to be affected by more diet-related issues, and diseases like higher levels of diabetes, other chronic diseases. And we started seeing that there was definitely a clear, there was definitely a racial component that was happening, and people of color were experiencing these food insecurities and the results of these food insecurities much more than white people. All right. And then when we focus on DC, we start seeing that this is really, you can't look at food insecurity in DC and not also look at the racial component and how it breaks down racially. So DC, we have a lot of grocery stores in DC. Probably I think at this point over 50 full service grocery stores. But the vast majority of them, all of them, but like three are west of the river. And if you look at east of the river, which are primarily Black communities, Black majority communities, we start seeing a much less. We see, I think there's three full service grocery stores that are serving, something like 150,000 residents. And then at the same time, we also see like these enormous health disparities that are happening east of the river. We see like, people that live in Ward 2, Ward 2, I think, is right up here. They live 16 years longer than people who live in Ward 8. And Ward 2 is predominantly white majority community, and Ward 8 is predominantly Black, community. And Ward 8 residents are 5 times more likely to die from diabetes. So we start seeing this not only the location of our grocery stores are along racial patterns, but we also see the outcomes and diet related diseases are also along racial lines as well. So if you look at, there's a really great definition called supermarket redlining by Jerry Shannon. I'll read it. Supermarket redlining resists framing disparities in access to healthy foods as a just side effect of an otherwise functional market or some natural urban ecology, as a bug in the system, so to speak. Rather, it highlights how the locational decisions of food retailers are evidence of intentional disinvestment in low-income neighborhoods and communities of color. So this is really important, that it's not, these food insecurities are not just like a bug in the system. This wasn't like something that that wasn't supposed to happen. A lot of these food insecurities are actually an actual result of how the systems that we're operating in. It's a direct result. It's a natural consequence of a lot of our systems that we're operating in right now. So a lot of people were searching for better ways to kind of really, approach, food insecurity and approach food deserts and to better understand, what's causing this food insecurity. So just in the last couple of years, a lot of people, a lot of food justice advocates are moving towards this new framework called a food apartheid framework. And the word apartheid, so the Oxford Dictionary, apartheid is a policy of systems or system of segregation or discrimination on grounds of race. So it's creating, specific laws and systems and policies that treat, one group of people differently than another group based on race. So we saw this emerge in South Africa, definitely in the 80s, with they had an apartheid government that had specific laws that discriminated against people of color, and we see we see this throughout the world happening as well. I know there's whether I know that this is a very passionate issue, and whether either side that you're on. But if you look at Israel and Palestine, Israel has set over 70 specific laws that are focused on Palestinians and on marginalizing and discriminating against Palestinians. So those laws and those policies are apartheid laws. And we sell this idea in America that we used to have apartheid, called Jim Crow, where we had Jim Crow laws that specifically focused on people of color, but we got, we fixed it in the 60s and then everything's fine now. But in reality, when we really look at the history, whenever we fix a system like slavery or Jim Crow, it never completely goes away, but it transforms into these new systems. And we're going to talk about a lot of those systems in the next hour. So it's a couple, definitions from a couple people that's helping establish this new framework. Karen Washington from the Rise and Root Forum, she says, "What I would rather say instead of food desert is food apartheid, because food apartheid looks at the whole system along with race, geography, faith, and economics. You say food apartheid and you get to the root cause of some of the problems around the food system. It brings us to the more important question: what are some of the social inequalities that you see, and what are you doing to erase some of the injustices?" And then Leah Penniman, really amazing food justice advocate. She runs this farm called Soul Fire Farm up in New York. Does a lot of great work. She's quoted as saying, "Food apartheid is a human-created system of segregations which relegates some people to food opulence and other people to food scarcity. It results in an epidemic of diabetes, heart disease, obesity, and other diet-related illnesses that are plaguing communities of color." And then Tony Lawson's a really amazing food justice advocate in Ward 8 says, "Now we're calling it food deserts. What it is, it's food apartheid. It's something that's planned. A desert is natural. It's manufactured by the planet. This is planned and this is obvious." So a lot of these definitions come around really start painting a bigger picture that this food security just didn't happen. This isn't a glitch in the system. It's not just this natural thing that occurred, but it was a direct result from planned policies that specifically targeted people of color and specifically Black people. So now we start looking at, well, what are some of these policies that created this food insecurity? This is a really great book. If you haven't read this yet, Dr. Ashante Reese wrote this. She's an amazing scholar. She I think from North Carolina University. This was her dissertation. She came down to DC and kind of recorded, and looked at Deanwood. Deanwood is a black community in Ward 7, a very food insecure community, and she kind of took oral histories from people about that community over the last century, and found that early 1900s this community had tons of community grocery stores, had a ton of farmers markets, and on all had really great food access. And then over the last century, they've lost that food access, and they're becoming a very insecure, food insecure community. So it's a really great book if you haven't read it. It's a really easy read. A lot of its oral history is not very heavy in statistics and things like that. But we're going to kind of just dive into some of the things that kind of help cause Deanwood and other communities around the country help cause their levels of food insecurity, which many communities didn't have that a century ago. So if you go back to so I'm just going to on this slide, we're just going to kind of walk through this as chronologically and talk, really briefly talk about each thing, just so everyone kind of gets a sense of order, and then we'll dive a little bit deeper into each one of these things after this slide. But the first thing, if you go back to Deanwood in early 1900s, there was a lot of housing discrimination, particularly in the north, of where black people could and couldn't live. Racial covenants, or like deeds that you could. Your housing deeds that said they couldn't, sell your house or rent to people of color, to like, zonings, and all different, redlining and things like that. We'll talk about in a second. But out of that formed a lot of very strong black communities. When they did find places they could live, they created these really, it's not because of, but in spite of, they overcame a lot of the segregation, a lot of Jim Crow and things like that, and actually created very self-sufficient communities. A lot of these, these black, strong black communities, were formed all throughout the North and in the West and all over the country. And Deanwood was one of them, where they had, because they couldn't really, they didn't have access to a lot of resources in DC and a lot of like food markets and things, because there was so much discrimination that they created a lot of their own, food security networks. Like they had, I think something like, around, 15 to 20 different local, corner community, grocery store, community owned co-ops and grocery stores. They had, direct connections with farmers that would come in on wagons and sell their food directly to people. They had farmers markets. A lot of them, they had land where they could grow a lot of food. And that was going, at least food wise, there was a lot of other issues they had to deal with, but at least food wise, they were they had a very food secure community in the early 1900s. And that really started to crumble. Kind of the roots of it started with the invention of supermarkets. So supermarkets, definitely, started becoming popular around in the 30s and 40s. A lot of these supermarkets, Safeways and Giants, particularly Safeway, kind of, hit DC around the 30s and 40s. So these were, and then they were also happening during the Industrial Revolution, during commercialization and industrialization of our food systems, where they were getting access to aggregates of cheap food, and a lot of this cheap processed food, like the TV dinners and things like that were being invented around the 30s and 40s and 50s, and so these new supermarkets, came in. They had everything you wanted. It was very convenient. They were huge, food stores. They had cheap food, because they're, getting it. A lot of it was unhealthy food, but we didn't know that at the time. So, eventually they ran out a lot of these community stores and these farmers markets and things. They ran them out of business, which was fine for a while, because they were still able to. They were still able to meet their needs. They were still able to get, their food from these supermarkets. But eventually, what eventually happened was called white flight, and so we and that kind of changed things up a little bit. So when we talk about white flight, we oftentimes we teach about it as these a bunch of personal decisions. Like a bunch of white people got scared because black people were moving in their community, so they decided to leave and live out in the suburbs. And that's part of the story. There was a lot, especially with desegregation of schools and things like that. And even if you didn't like, even if you're on board, if you're okay with black people moving in, the banks were not okay, and your property value can could fall and all the different kinds of things. So there was a lot of push, but that's kind of a small part of the story. What white flight really is this massive federal investment into white people, into building white community and white ownerships called the New Deal. And when we often teach the New Deal, we teach about that it focused on three different things. It focused on building a lot of like social safety nets during the Great Depression. It was FDR's program to kind of bring the country out of the Great Depression. So he had a lot of workers' rights and right to unionize, child labor laws, things. So there was a lot of workers' rights, and then there was a lot of safety nets. And then his third biggest thing was he wanted to build home ownership, because he knew that was like the best way to accrue wealth and to build a middle class was to give people ownership of their homes. But at the time, he was operating what's called the Southern Voting Bloc. So this came about. So after slavery, there was this really quick time period called the Reconstruction, particularly radical Reconstruction, where there was, that's where we got like the 14th Amendment and 15th Amendment, gave black people citizenship and right to vote, or at least black males, and so they. Without getting too much into it, there was a brief moment of like this effort on reparations, the 40 acres and mule, on military enforced, equality. But that, fell apart. I mean, it didn't fall apart. It was defeated by the return of like white supremacy to the South, where it went through like the KKK, the terrorism, voter suppression, and eventually, after about 10 years, the South returned to basically how the government was, pre-Civil War. The Confederates and came back into power, and since then it's been from then till like the 50s and 60s. It was just a solid. We call it a Southern voting bloc. Like Dixiecrats and stuff, where they just opposed anything that had to do with civil rights, desegregation, things like that. So in order to actually pass, legislation, you had to find clever ways to exclude people of color. And I don't know if FDR personally did this or his administration or what, but they knew they couldn't get the New Deal passed unless they found ways to exclude people of color. So when it came to like workers' rights and safety nets, they picked two fields, occupational fields that were predominantly were most black people worked in, farm workers and domestic workers, and they excluded those people from most of those rights and most of those social safety nets and things like that. So that was one way how they got those passed. But then how they got that home ownership, passed, which is basically they created the Federal Housing Association and poured in billions, of dollars into backing government-backed home loans. Because at the time, if you wanted a home, there wasn't, much insurance. A lot of that insurance got wiped. Housing insurance got wiped out in the Great Depression. So if you wanted a home, you had to basically pay 50% of the home up front, and then pay the rest of it. You had to pay the rest of the home off in like 3 to 5 years. So only rich people were buying homes. So the FDR created our mortgage system, basically what kind of mortgage system we have today through the Federal Housing Association, where the government backed banks, banking loans. So banks were less stressed and less worried. So they gave better loans where, like the loans that we see today, where you can only, with like a small down payment, and then you have like 30 years to pay off your home. So they created that mortgage system. But in order to actually get it, passed, they had to create these clever ways to kind of exclude people of color from that. So that's where they created the system called redlining. So they created these risk assessment maps for the banks. And actually, the federal government, they couldn't do it. There were some Supreme Court cases that prevented them from actually discriminating against people of color, but the private industry could. So they hired real estate agents and real estate industries to create these risk assessment maps. And they did this with every municipality in America. And they created these maps where essentially, if it was like a white community, you got a blue color, meant that was, low risk, and then as it, starts getting more diverse, or if it would be like yellow and different colors, and then red was basically communities of color or very mixed communities. And so if you lived in the red map, zone, you were considered too risky to get a loan. And so majority, all people of color, most majority of people of color live in those zones. So that excluded them from this housing initiative. And if you look at the statistics, between 1936 and 37, when the Federal Housing Association was built, up until 68, when the Fair Housing Act was passed, that supposedly outlawed redlining, but it still happened for a while, and it's still in different ways happening today. But if you look in that time period, that 30-year time period, 98% of home loans went to white people. And that's a huge amount of wealth. We're talking billions and billions of dollars. And it wasn't just home loans. It was also like the GI Bill and stuff where it was housing loans. It was like money to actually build these communities and to build suburbs and all these different things all went to white people. So it wasn't just that white people got up and moved, to the suburbs. It was also they got up and they took all the wealth that they accumulated during slavery, that they accumulated, generational during Jim Crow, that all this like billions of dollars that the federal government was pumping into through the Federal Housing Association, and they took all that wealth and they took it out to the suburbs. And that's really important to understand, and that black people they couldn't follow, they couldn't follow that wealth because of redlining, because of all this housing discrimination. So they were kept in these poor communities, in urban communities. They lost their funding, and they were just massively disinvested, and they just create this massive concentration of poverty. But it's important. I mean, I do this activity where to better understand this, we think about. We all, hopefully it's still fresh, the 2008 recession that they all went through. So that imagine if our government at the time, saw this recession, saw all this suffering that was happening, across the country, and they decided that they're going to pump, their solution is they're going to spend $1 trillion, which is, roughly, I've seen estimates how much money we spent on Federal Housing Association and GI Bill, today would have been around $1 trillion over a 30-year period. So imagine if we spent $1 trillion over the just focusing money on white home ownership. In bank loans and construction loans for white communities, and then the GI Bill, we started putting having all this funding for white education, and for like white job training. Highway bills, we started pumping all this money to build highways through black communities to make it more accessible for white communities. Imagine we did that for 30 years. We just pumped a massive amount of federal funds into white communities and white home ownership. And then at the end of that, we 30 years, we're like, well, we realized that wasn't very fair. So we passed a bunch of civil rights bills that outlawed that continuing doing it, but did nothing to repair the damage done. There was no Black New Deal. There was no, reparations, no economic injustice, no efforts to fix the enormous, racial wealth gap that was created from this. And we passed that, civil rights, and we outlawed it. We even left a lot of holes where a lot of this can continue going for the next 50 years. And then when black communities started, complaining, we all of a sudden made these myths, white people just worked harder. You need to take more personal responsibility. There must be something wrong with your culture, your family, the absentee black father myth, which is totally made up. So that's basically, very similar to what happened, and we need to understand the massive amount of not only racial wealth gap, but also segregation that the New Deal and the GI Bill created for these communities. So going back to, all these white people moved to these suburbs, brought a massive amount of wealth to these suburbs as well, and then we started seeing the massive disinvestment into the black communities that weren't allowed to move out to the suburbs as well. And then that's when we really start seeing this massive concentration of poverty over the next, several decades after white, flight. We start seeing these policies of disinvestment, of benign neglect, massive disinvestment into these communities. That's just creating this, horrible concentration of poverty right now. And then at the same time, the industries, a lot of people, moved to these urban environments after, during the wars, especially the black people from the South, because there was jobs and factories, available for them during the World War I and World War II. But then those factories, they started closing down and started moving out to the, white suburbs. So we see a deindustrialization movement happening again. And then at the same time, the supermarkets are starting to realize, well, all the wealth is moving out to suburbs, so they start following as well. So all these Safeways that started opening up in Deanwood and ran out all these community, grocery stores, start closing down as well in the 60s and 70s and 80s, and we start seeing what we call supermarket redlining, where the supermarkets start moving their old stores to the suburbs and then only locating new stores in the suburbs and white communities as well. And that's what really creates this massive food insecurity, and that leads us with today. We have an enormous racial wealth gap right now, where white households have 16 times as much wealth as black households, and there's an enormous amount of housing discrimination. And then in the middle of that, we're experiencing a housing crisis as well, on top of gentrification and all these different things that we're going to dive a little bit deeper into in a second. All right. So I put all this together in one slide because I kind of want to just, even though these are estimates, so this happened differently all across the country at different times, but I wanted to kind of just walk people through, how we went from, food secure neighborhood to where we are today, and kind of the issues. And it's not just, if you imagine, white people showing up to these black communities just saying, and not knowing any of this, and just saying, hey, you guys have a food problem, we'll just get you some food and everything's fine. When in reality, these are the roots that we need to start focusing on. These are the economic injustices that we need to start focusing on as well. Now, on top of that, we also had, rise of mass incarceration, war on drugs, all these different other factors as well happening. But like I said, we're just going to be focusing on spatial racism for now. So now we walk through the timeline. I'm going to dive a little bit deeper, but let's see. I got about 20 minutes before I want to get to the solution slide. So I'm just going to highlight a couple different things about each one, just to give a little bit more background. But this is one of the reasons why I put way too much information on all these slides. I want these slides to be resources where, if we don't get a chance to talk with them, you can research them as yourself. And yeah. But when we talk about segregation, if you open up, if you go into most school textbooks, and you open up to the backstage, the glossary, and look up segregation, and then go to the page it says to go to. I guarantee when you open it up, the first thing you're going to see is a water fountain. Because that's true. I mean, I'm not going to downplay it. I mean, it was it was pretty awful that people had to drink from different water fountains, especially it was on a dignity aspect. But I think we kind of push that image because it's a more of a whitewashed image, less serious. When in reality, when we talk about segregation, specifically Jim Crow was this massive policy and infrastructures to disenfranchise and marginalize and literally kill people of color. It wasn't just water fountains. It was also schools. We funded black schools way less than we funded white schools. It was also hospitals. If you look at the rates of infant mortality rates among black mothers in the South during Jim Crow, is just atrocious. And that was because most moms had their babies at home because the hospitals they lived by, they couldn't even, they weren't allowed to attend because they were white hospitals and only black doctors can treat black patients at that time. It was about lynching. Thousands of people were lynched, and when we say lynching is when community members, kill these people, kill black people outside the law, and they make up excuses like, oh, that black person, raped this white woman. And in reality, we know that most of that was wrong. Most of it was because of it was getting rid of their economic ability, competition. It was about keeping sharecroppers in place, or it was about enforcing white supremacy. But a lot of these lynchings would be these big events where there were picnics with, families would come out, they would, serve food, and they would just torture these black people to death. So everyone knew who was doing it, but no one was ever convicted because of Jim Crow. All the juries were white. So even if you try to prosecute somebody, the white juries, white judges, white lawyers, it was just impossible. And so so Jim Crow just created this horrible situation for black people with terrorism and economic disenfranchisement. So that's when we start saying we whitewash. Another great whitewash term is the Great Migration. So we teach the Great Migration is when millions, like something like 8 million black people migrated from the South to the North and to the West. But in reality, they weren't migrating. They were fleeing. They were internally displaced people that were fleeing, terrorism. And to prove this point, I mean, most of them had to leave in the middle of the night. They had to escape. There was KKK people hanging out at train stations trying to capture these people and bring them back to their sharecropping. And this is the most part is because the South, much like most of this country, our food systems are built on exploited labor. Whether it's slaves, whether it's sharecroppers, convict leasers, even today, whether it's immigrant, exploited migrant and immigrant workers. So, I mean, they literally, were killing people to try to keep them in the South so they can continue to exploit them, their labor. But many of them, millions of them did escape the South, and then they headed to, the North and the West, and thinking that, because the Jim Crow was only in the South, they were thinking that things were going to be better in the North and West. And what they found was that the situations were just as awful. They ride to these cities, and there horrible housing discrimination, horrible employment discrimination, and it's like really awful racial hierarchy that was brutally enforced by the police in the North and the West, and that's really important to understand, that was the foundations of a lot of these black communities that we're now trying to help. One thing I want to point out, so I'm not going to go over all this stuff, but I want to point out one thing is exclusionary zoning, because this is something that's happening still today when it comes to housing and segregation, housing discrimination. Like in Baltimore in the early 1900s, they tried to have racial zones where black people could live in one zone and white people could live in another, and that was thrown to the Supreme Court and it was overturned, or it was outlawed, so they couldn't do that. So this was in the early 1900s. So President Hardy at the time, in the early 1920s, he put together this commission on zoning, because no one was really zoning before the 1920s. And he created these really clever exclusionary zoning that doesn't seem racist, but the end result was that people of color were trapped in these concentrated poverty communities. So he created things like single family units and density laws and industrial zoning, which all seem very race neutral, but when we really start dissecting it, like the single family units, that's something that we still use today. I'll show you a map of affordable housing in DC, and it's almost all, there's none of it, west of Rock Creek, and that's mainly because of single family unit ordinances, because they know, if you build apartment complexes, you can create those, much more affordable. But in order to keep people from moving their communities, they basically zone out any affordable housing through these ordinances. So President Hardy, he put together this commission of really self-declared, segregationists and white supremacists, and they went around to hundreds of cities and they trained all these cities on how to actually do these exclusionary zoning in a way, and especially with industrial zoning, they purposely put industrial zoning and where we're going to put toxic industries in communities of color, so that would devalue communities. It would keep them from accruing wealth, so they wouldn't actually ever be able to move into white communities. So that's really important to understand. We'll talk a little bit more about that later, but that's something that's still happening today. And it's really important to understand that segregation is not just about diversity. It's not about diversity in your communities. It's really about access to resources. If you look at a study from last year, it said white schools receive $23 billion more than non-white schools. That's $733 more per student. So white majority schools are way more funded, even at the point where this is supposed to be illegal. So it's not just about freedom of living everywhere. It's also about access to resources, better hospitals, better schools, better parks, better, economic opportunities. And so segregation is a way to keep concentrated poverty that's happening in communities of color. And at the same time, majority of white people, because of this, are living in these in these white communities. And and you can see that just by perception. There's a lot of studies that came out in the last couple of years about majority of white people. It's a simple majority, but majority of white people in these studies, feel like they're being discriminated against just as much, if not more, than people of color. And that's just it's grossly untrue. But that's what you create these white segregated worlds where you don't see what's happening outside of them. So it's very easy to kind of fall into that trap. That's the background of where communities like Deanwood started to approach. This is a map from Deanwood from the Black Food Geographies, where these are all the different grocery stores and farmers markets and stuff that Deanwood used to have in the early 1900s. All right, and then industrial and healthy food. So again, in the 30s and 40s, we start seeing, this is, some of the early Safeways. They used to be called sanitary grocery, but then they got sued for not hiring black people, and they went to Supreme Court and they lost. And very shortly, they changed the name to Safeway. This is, Safeway opened up in D.C. in the 30s, and we really start seeing this jump, from the 50s. Supermarkets were only about a third of the market, and up into the 60s, there's two-thirds. And a lot of that has to do with industrialization of farming. There's a lot more cheaper food, a lot more processed food. It's a lot easier. Like I said, people didn't really know about TV dinners and processed food and the health, costs that was going to have on the public health on people. So that's, the first TV dinners in 1955. And then that's, after those, supermarkets ran out all the stores, then we start seeing white flight, and everyone's moving to the suburbs. A really great book. If you haven't read this yet, it's called The Color of Law. It really documents really well that all the white flight and the housing discrimination that's happened over the last century. It's a fantastic book that everyone should definitely read. And it's happened, through all different programs, from public housing, to redlining, to GI Bill had funding to build entire communities, but on the condition that they all had to have racial covenants, that only white people could live in these communities. And if you look at the outcomes, like I said, between 34 to 68, there was a 30-year period where 98% of home loans only went to white people. So that's an enormous amount of wealth. And at the same time, Federal Housing Association, put in over $100 billion into new housing construction for white people. They financed a lot of private construction. And at the same time, we know that a lot of our wealth, around a third of our wealth is generational, is passed down in inherited wealth. So that just, created this white middle class that is just constantly accruing more and more wealth, while the, black people and people of color were stuck in these communities that were much more concentrated poverty. At the same time, we had, we talked about deindustrialization and disinvestment into these communities that were left behind, these urban communities. And the big one was like urban redevelopments. So these came through, they were funded by federal highway acts that essentially paid, 90% of construction costs to any city that wanted to redo a blighted area. And blight is just a fancy, a lot of these communities, they needed investments, they needed to be fixed up. But a lot of times blighted communities, it was code word for community of color that they wanted to kick out. So like a really great example, Southwest Waterfront in DC. So this was like, there was like, 20 or 30,000 people. There was like hundreds of thriving businesses. I mean, don't get me wrong, it definitely could have used community investment funds, but instead they kicked everybody out, and they completely redid the whole front, Southwest front, and they built in highways and housing that no one could afford but white people, and completely renewed that whole area. And at the same time, there was no compensation for the 20,000 black people that were kicked out. A lot of public housing was built in concentrated poverty, and then they just threw these people into these public housing, and this happened all over the country, and just hundreds of thousands of people of color were were displaced through these highway acts and these urban developments. And same with public housing. Public housing started in the 30s. A lot of DC public housing units were built in the 30s and 40s and 50s. But around the 50s and 60s, we start seeing this massive change and its disinvestment. And it got even worse up until, like, especially in the 80s. We saw huge cuts into housing and public housing, and to the point where now in DC, like we just last year, DC government declared that there was something like 15 or 16 public housing units that were deemed unlivable. They were so, because I mean, they just had not had any funding to like fix these housing units for so long, and they don't have any funding still. So I mean. Yeah, I mean, that's housing. Public housing was this great thing up into the 50s and 60s, and then we saw this continual disinvestment over the last half century. At the same time, planned shrinkage and municipal divestments are all fancy words, benign neglect to just like disinvesting these communities. Like, if you ever heard the phrase "the Bronx is burning," that's because the South Bronx was just so disinvested in the 60s and 70s that they literally cut all their fire stations out and all these fires kept on happening, and there was no one that can put out the fires, and it's just this massive amount of poverty they created from disinvestments into these urban communities. And this really hit with a neoliberal movement in the 80s with Reagan, who just drastically, I mean, you really can't downplay or minimize just how much how harmful Reagan was for Black communities, Black urban communities. The life expectancy of Black people went down. He just, during his presidency, he had massive amount of cuts to housing, to social safety nets, to public health programs, and at a time where he took all that money and then he invested and he moved that money to these massive tax cuts into huge military contracts, and to also help fund the rise of mass incarceration and this war on drugs. So it really, I mean, you can't downplay just how awful that was for Black communities. Then at the same time, we have supermarket redlining. We talked about this is a picture of Anacostia in the late 70s. Their Safeway was closing down. This is Deanwood, or at least close to Deanwood, and so people were actually protesting, trying to stop them from closing down, but they were unsuccessful. And then we see this massive amount of racial wealth gap that's occurring right now. 16 times the median, white households have majority of the wealth right now. And we sell this idea it's just because we worked harder or whatever, but in reality, it's because, it has a lot to do with the policies of this country, particularly, especially over the last century. And we talk about, this is really great. This is a great quote from Color Law, but it talks about how, housing discrimination, redlining is outlawed now, but now, I mean, no one can afford it. Back in the 40s and 50s, Black people could afford, they could have afforded, a lot of these homes, but now these homes are so expensive in these white communities that they can't afford it now. So now we like whitewashed our hands of it, and we're just like, oh, now it's just a market thing. You just, you can't afford it now, when in reality that affordability came from racist policies. And at the same time, we're seeing a huge affordable housing crisis where like wages have not raised since the 1970s. Even though we've been, every year we're more and more productive as a society, we're getting paid less and less. And so while we're getting less and less money, housing rents is still raising. Programs, housing programs, affordable housing programs are losing funding, and it's just creating this point where millions of people are homeless right now, looking for housing, or living in unaffordable situations. And even the affordable housing. So they base so this is a map of DC, and you can clearly see all the affordable housing. These dots are affordable housing units. They are all either east of river or west east of Rock Creek, and then these are all the white rich communities, and there's no public housing, and that is because of their zoning policies. And even the housing they can get to, they base housing the public affordable housing rates are based on the idea that you should only be spending a third of your income on housing, but they base that on area median incomes, AMI. And our area median income is not just DC; it includes a lot of wealthy suburbs. So that really skewed the fact that our area median income is $117,000 for a family of four, which white families that's pretty accurate, but black families. Are making a fraction of that. So if your affordable housing rates are 30% of the area median income, that means that black families are literally supposed to spend their entire amount of income on their affordable housing, rent. And that's one of the reasons why even affordable housing is too expensive right now, based on the systems, and it definitely needs to be reformed. All right, so last thing I'm going to talk about before we get into solutions is gentrification, and this is really important to understand because this is we're in the middle of a big gentrification movement. I'm going to read this quote from National Community Reinvestment Coalition. Gentrification is a powerful force for economic change in our cities, but it is also accompanied by extreme and unnecessary cultural displacement. While gentrification increases the value of properties in areas that suffered that suffered from prolonged disinvestments, it also results in rising rents, home and property values. These rising costs reduce the supply of affordable housing. Existing residents who are often Black or Hispanic are displaced. This prevents them from benefiting from the economic growth and greater availability of services that come with increased disinvestment. Gentrification presents a challenge to communities that are trying to achieve economic revitalization without the disruption that comes with displacement. So gentrification. So there was a study, National Community Reinvestment Coalition did a study between 2000 and 2013, and they found that gentrification was happening and displacement was happening in almost every city in this country right now. But they found that DC, in particular, DC was the worst. That it was happening at the quickest pace, and it was happening, and it was displacing more Black residents than any other city right now. So when we talk about gentrification, we sell. It's very intentional that we sell this idea that gentrification is a bunch of hipsters and coffee shops and yoga studios that are just pushing people out. But and that's part of the I don't want to minimize. We're all a part of this. We all need to make decisions that either help or hurt gentrification every day, and we need to take accountability. But gentrification really is what it really is local government policies deciding on which communities deserve funding and investment, and which communities don't deserve funding and investment. And that's really important to understand, that gentrification are intentional result of local policies. So if we look at DC, so these are really great books if you want to learn more about gentrification in DC, history of DC, Chocolate City and Capital Dilemma. I feel like this should be a requirement before you move to DC to read these two books. But they talk about how DC has had four different levels phases of gentrification, like Georgetown early 1900s, Foggy Bottoms in the 30s and 40s, Columbia Heights in the 60s and 70s or 80s, and then we're in our fourth phase, but this is one of the worst because this is affecting more than half the city right now. It is experiencing some form of gentrification, and this really was it was intentional policies that caused a lot of this, and it really came about because you really have to understand just how much it sucks not being a state. So we just got our vote, our local government, our autonomy, our home rule. We got that in the 70s, but it was under a lot of conditions. Some of the conditions were that we couldn't have a commuter tax. So even though majority of people, working in DC, I don't know majority, but a lot of people working in DC live in Maryland and Virginia. Normally, cities would just have a commuter tax, and they would tax people, that come into these cities and work. But we're not allowed to do that, so that's a massive amount of economic funding that we lose. And at the same time, a lot of our land is federal government, and we can't tax that. So it's hard. It was definitely hard in the beginning to actually balance the budget. And in the 1990s, we actually our DC local government went bankrupt. And then the federal government had to come in, and they created a federal, financial board, which is very similar to, how they ruled DC for the last century before we got home rule. Enacted all these different policies that stringent policies that and they got the government back into the budget back balanced by the early 2000s, and then DC took back over. they enacted a lot of austerity, but policies. I forgot that what that word was. So it was pretty impactful to a lot of, especially to a lot of poor communities. When they got, when DC got their government back, there was this big push not to let that ever happen again. Mayor Anthony Williams at the time, there was a lot of recommendations to him, like if you want to never let that happen again, you need to attract more people and build up your tax base. So he launched a whole bunch of different initiatives to try to attract more people to the city. Like his goal was to bring 100,000 new people, particularly what they call the creative class, which is like a fancy word for middle class to upper class white people that can actually build industries that attract more and more people. The idea was to, so he directed a lot of the budget, his budget towards investments and subsidies and developments that would attract more white people. At the same time, there was a lot of disinvestment into Black communities and poor communities as well. And we're seeing the direct result of a lot of this as we're seeing like the public housing, neglected public housing, unaffordable housing, a lot of displacement, a lot happening right now. So I definitely recommend, read these two books if you want to learn more about what's happening in DC right now. And then, okay, so I'm going to just go really quickly, and then I think this is the last slide, and then we're going to go into solutions. Other factors is not just, we just looked at housing and spatial awareness, but other factors, range from like, criminal justice system to Black land theft, to just the 60s civil rights bills and their inability to actually, fix past harm, to the rise of the modern Republican Party, which I'm not trying to, get too political, but a lot of people don't really understand that the GOP, our modern Republican Party, was built in the 50s and 60s, and it continued up into the 80s in direct opposition to civil rights and desegregation, and including they created what was called dog whistle politics, what we call the Southern strategy. That's where they created much more socially acceptable ways to enforce racist policies, and like instead of saying the N word or preaching segregation, he starts, talking about states' rights and law and order and like, illegal immigration and illegals and things like that. And you create all these, what we call racial dog whistles that sound much more socially acceptable and sound very race neutral, but in fact, they use it to push through a lot of racist policies. So if you want to learn more about that, the rise of that, this is a really amazing book. I definitely recommend Dog Whistle Politics. Anyway, okay. So now we're going to talk about possible solutions and ways to get involved in DC, knowing that food security isn't just by itself, but it's attached to a lot of different other systems and housing and things like that that we need to also kind of dive into. So the first one is, so we're involved with a lot, definitely in the food systems. We have this thing called food sovereignty. I'll read the La Via Campesina definition. The right of peoples to healthy and culturally appropriate food produced through ecological sound and sustainable methods, and their right to define their own food and agricultural systems. So this is a new, not a new concept, but this is something that we push a lot in food justice systems. It's not just about saying, hey, look, there's a poor community that needs food. Let's just get them food, and then everything's fine. It's about actually building food systems in that community, and giving control to the community over every aspect of what kind of food, culture appropriate food, what kind of businesses, co-ops, and about creating jobs and creating local markets and local systems of food access. And that comes with a lot of what we call community first approaches, where it's not about we have to really fight this white saviorism where we come in and say, I know what's best for you. And then push in these projects, which that's a lot of urban agriculture is a lot of that's happening right now. But it's more about it's more about working with communities, understanding their needs, building these projects, and making them involved in every step, from designing the projects to the leaderships, to rules and having checks and balances and things like that. And it's also about opening up resources. Like a lot of white organizations look at these Black communities as a way to get funding for themselves. Like they'll write, grants, saying they want to help these communities with, use their poor health statistics of these Black communities, and then they'll get grants to pay themselves to do projects that no one's ever even heard of or never even asked for. So it's about opening up access to these resources and to jobs and funding and things for these communities. And also a big thing that we're trying to do right now is we're trying to build what we call actual local food economies. It's not just about growing food, but it's also about building, distribution centers, cold storage centers. Like if you don't have a place to actually, refrigeration for your crops, you're not getting to the market the next day. About value-added processing, commercial kitchens where people can actually make products that are going to bring in more money. It's about entrepreneurship training, affordable markets, things like that. So we're working with a lot of organizations like Dreaming Out Loud, the Arc Farm, DC Urban Greens, that are trying to build these whole local food economies. Like right now, we're trying, in particular, like we're trying to build business incubator spaces and commercial kitchen spaces, because a lot of times, say you want to grow a bunch of food, but just selling that food alone is not going to help you make ends meet. So you can process it and make and meals, prepackaged meals and stuff at these commercial kitchens. But commercial kitchen space is super expensive, and there's a lot of incubator spaces, or shared kitchen spaces, but those are also pretty expensive. So we're trying to work on. We're actually right now. There's a rec center in Ward 8 called Congress Heights. We're renovating it, and we're going to build it out. We're building a new rec center next year, and as of right now, we're still working with the community. We still have to get, we're going through different community meetings, but we're trying to build a 1,500 square foot, commercial kitchen space, and a 800 square foot. Grocery co-op, where nonprofits, local community nonprofits, can not only process their food, at these spaces, but also can sell it, at these spaces, at these cooperative markets at reasonable rates. So a lot of that, like targeted funding, trying to, do different, initiatives and stuff. But a big part is like, if you're part of an organization that actually has funding and gives funding to these communities, is really being intentional to making sure that funding goes to communities, organizations of color, and not to white organizations that are going to manage these projects. There's a really great initiative called In Deep Initiative. It's a resource guide. It's basically a blueprint on how to get the money to organizations of color. Involved with food initiatives, and then community advocacy trainings, training people on how to advocate for budget cycles and land and usage and things like that. So. But a lot of what we do is just bring awareness to a lot of the jobs and grants and programs out there. And that's one thing we do. We have a monthly newsletter called the Doug Network, where it's every two times a month. And it's just a super long, ugly newsletter, but it's full of like tons of jobs and tons of grant opportunities and training programs and things like that. So I think a lot of this is just bringing awareness and transparency to the resources that are out there. And then a lot of people always ask, well, what can I do, personally? And I think so. I created this like 5 steps, 5 things that everyone can do, and I think it's very some of it's very timely right now, but a lot of it is just realizing with gentrification, realizing with this past history, and especially if we're moving into these communities that are experiencing all this stuff, we really need to start understanding the outcomes and how we can get more involved. And the first thing I always tell people is like, try to create an alternative to calling the cops plan. So this is super important. Hopefully everyone kind of realizing that there can be some really bad consequences with calling the cops on Black people, especially in Black spaces, and we need to try to create alternative options. Like there's a really great plan that you can download or from our website, or you can send me an email, or it's on. We're just outlining, all the numbers from like community mediation, like homeless advocates, mental health lines. The idea is. Police should be the last people that you call. You should try to call different, try to find help before you call, on the police. And just, having a plan too before, you don't want to like, all of a sudden see something happening and then like analyzing your brain in real time. Should I call the police or not? Having like spending some time under knowing your own boundaries and what you're comfortable with and who and different people you can call before making those plans before something that happens. And then also financially supporting volunteering, amplifying local organizations that are working on initiatives like housing. There's some really great organizations like Empower DC, One DC, DC Grassroots Planning Coalition that are working on bringing more affordable housing and fighting different kinds of gentrification movements. Anti-racism, Black Lives Matter has their own division. Black Youth, Project, Stop Police Terror Project. Surge is a really great organization if you're white and you're kind of new to all this. It's a white anti-racism organization that kind of helps people, trains people, helps people understanding things before, and it helps connect you to how to get involved. It's a really great organization if you're new to a lot of this. Then, supporting food sovereignty, like Dreaming Out Loud and DC Urban Greens, and supporting them on helping build local food economies. Doing your own internal anti-racism work. If you're not, we all were born into these societies, these white supremacist societies. We've all absorbed, internalized these things. If you're not doing your own work, you're going to show up to these meetings and you can cause some harm. So it is important to kind of like Sandra Kim has this really great online workshop about identifying your internalized white supremacy and working on actually being able to process a lot of that stuff, and it's working about being a better ally. There's a really great video. There's a lot of great videos on YouTube about being allies, but I wish I posted it, but it's really, just watch like a 3 or 4 minute YouTube video on what it means to be an ally, just so that we're amplifying, and promoting people of color's voices, and not co-opting and not censoring whiteness and things like that. Just understanding local history. We have amazing resources in DC. From Anacostia Smithsonian has a Right to the City exhibit where it talks about all last century of housing right movements and urban developments and things. Prologue DC is like this nonprofit group of historians that analyze segregation and racial covenants and things, and give presentations on it around DC. A lot of great African American history museums. A lot of great books on the area. And then also just like when you're feeling, trying to tap into local advocacy. So that's why following our Facebook, our People School of DC, if you're trying to figure out different ways to tap in, every day there's some awesome event or meeting or training that's happening. And then, so it is 12:30, but I only got about 5 more minutes left, so I'm gonna go ahead and keep on going. Totally okay if you gotta bounce. And then I'll definitely stick around for questions and comments and things like that as well. Sorry, I haven't been answering everyone's questions in between slides, but yeah, I'm just going to spend about 5 more minutes wrapping up this presentation. Totally okay if you gotta go, but then let me, if you want to stick around, I'm happy to stay, for a while if you guys want to talk more. But a lot of this is about organizing. Power of DC, this great housing advocacy organization, they always talk about in our meetings that a lot of these developments that are happening in DC that are pushing out affordable housing and redoing neighborhoods, a lot of these things happen because there's no organized resistance. And one of the best ways to organize the resistance against housing is at tenant associations. So if you're in a apartment complex that doesn't have a tenant association, I definitely recommend trying researching that and trying to build one out and supporting those tenant associations. There's different efforts right now to build like citywide tenant associations and stuff. I think I have I mentioned who's I'll talk about that in a second. But also, just getting involved in local government budget cycles, knowing, at certain times, you have to advocate, from like agencies or council members or mayor. So knowing which person to advocate for at which time. Some of the biggest things is like zoning appeals, public hearings and comment periods and zoning appeals. Zoning appeals are like when we do those large developments, they a lot of times they go across multiple zones and they need to get zoning variances, decided by zoning, or DC zoning commission. And if you don't know it's happening, like that's a time where you need to show up and talk about the impacts that, the negative impacts that these developments could have on our communities. And a lot of times, there's not an organized force. So just really, learning more about these, tapping into the organizations that are presenting at these zoning appeals. And then but a lot of times, if this seems overwhelming, just tapping into these organizations, you don't need to start all this by yourself. Just joining some of these organizations. Just get on their mailing list. Becoming a monthly donor. Showing up to their monthly meetings. Like Empower DC and One DC are great organizations that will that plan actions against a lot of this gentrification and developments, and they'll help you. They need help. Showing up to zoning appeals and comment periods and things. And DC Grassroots Planning Coalition is like a big universal one that they have monthly meetings if you want to join them. And so a lot of great organizations. Fair Budget Coalition if you want to learn how to advocate, funding for our budgets. And then really quickly, I'm just these are some of the gentrification battles. I think this is the last slide after the resource slide. But some of these things, public housing fights are happening right now. Like the Berry Farms is an old public housing complex that, because it's been disinvested over the last half century, all of a sudden it needs these huge repairs and we don't have the budget for it. So they create our solution is to look to private developers. They'll foot the bill, with a lot of subsidies from the government, and then they'll rebuild something that has a lot less affordable housing units. And they claim it's because the market rate units are going to be are going to pay for all the maintenance and things that they have to do. So if you look at Berry Farms has 444 affordable housing units, and they're going to rebuild it with 100 less housing units. Same with like Brooklyn Manor, they're going to it's like 150 less housing affordable housing units. At the same time, even people can get back into their these large scale developments are going to end up gentrifying the neighborhood to the point where many people can't afford those neighborhoods anymore. So just like kind of learning about a lot of what's happening in these battles right now. And so this is a citywide tenant union. The Latino Economic Development Center is trying to organize citywide tenants. They're trying to organize all the tenant associations into a citywide one that's going to have much more power. So if you're in an apartment complex and you don't have a tenant association, these are the great people that kind of help organize that. And then a lot of times this could just be overwhelming if you're new to a lot of this work. So we actually at the People School we created this what's called anti-racism hierarchy to kind of help people not be overwhelmed, but just understand that where you're at and kind of tap in where you're at and kind of work. If you're new to this, maybe you just need to take some anti-racism classes, read more, start believe in people's color stories and experiences. But once you learn more, maybe need to participate more in actions and support communities, and then learn more, get to the level where you can start confronting coworkers and family members and racist actions, and then on the top is actually dismantling systems and building new policies and stuff. So a lot of this isn't it's about just recognizing where you're at and then plugging into where you're at and then slowly working towards becoming more and more involved. And then again check out our Facebook. There's events for every one of these. There's ways to kind of plug in and get involved. All right, so that's the last slide. Thank you all so much for listening to me. I'm going to go ahead and start reading some of these comments. Sorry, I stopped looking at the chat box for the last bit, but I'm going to be here for a while. So if you guys want to continue writing some comments, I'll try to get through everyone's questions. But thank you all so much for your time. Let's see. And if you want to talk some things out, feel free. You can unmute yourself as well if you have any questions or comments as well. But I'm trying to.
Hey, Josh, so we do have questions about A, sharing the recording, B, sharing the slides, including outside of USAID, and also maybe links to like the Doug Network, but we can share all of that with everyone, right?
Yeah, definitely. So the slides are all public. You can feel free to share those. The recordings, I'll edit the recordings, all the space in the beginning. I'll upload it to YouTube, and I'll send it to Erica to send out as well. And then yeah, we could forward, especially like the Doug Network newsletter. That's a really great way to kind of tap into a lot of this stuff. So we can send that link as well for people to sign up. Thank you all so much for your comments. I'm looking for if you did a question. I'm having a hard time finding the questions. Feel free to rewrite that question, and I'll get to it. I'm having a problem. My chat box is kind of all over the place.
One question that I thought was interesting is someone asked if granting DC statehood would be helpful to the movement. Your opinion?
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, that's a big. Like I was saying, I mean, that's a big problem right now, especially with our ability to raise funds. Uh, okay, I'm just going to stop sharing. So that's huge. I mean, we need DC statehood, and we need have full autonomy to be able to raise funds. Like things like commuter taxes would bring in a lot of revenue, so we could stop having to rely on bringing in more people and more tax bases. We can actually fund fund our government through a lot of commuter taxes, and just having the ability over our government. I mean, there's yeah, I mean, if you're new to DC statehood, there's a lot of reasons right now that we need to become a state. I mean, and we have more people in DC than I think. I'm gonna get this wrong, but I think that like the lowest 4 or 5 states populations total, and none of those people have we don't have the right to actually vote for have representation in Congress. So it's crazy. Hopefully, hopefully we'll get DC statehood because this will give us the power and the funding, the ability to raise funds to properly, fund things. I think. Okay, some question. Some of us live outside DC. Are there equivalent organizations in the surrounding counties in case we want to become active in our communities as well? Yeah, for sure. I mean, there's a lot. If you want to email me, I'll write my email in the chat box. If you want to email me any questions, I'm happy to kind of help. I'm not an expert on that stuff, but I have done some research, and depending on where you're at, I can hopefully direct you to different organizations working because this is not just a DC unique thing. This is food justice movement and its approach to a food apartheid. This is happening all over the country right now. So there's a lot of different ways that you can plug into. I'll be honest, I'm having a lot of trouble with my chat box. It's kind of all over the place. So if you did, post a question, if you could just retype that question in, I'd be happy to answer that question.
One of the questions that came up during one slide was about reading lists. Like you shared some books during the presentation, but is there a place where people can find a comprehensive list of your book recommendations?
Yeah, I mean, so if you go to People School DC, let me get the link real quick. There is we have a huge book list depending on recommendation book lists and depending on what you're interested in. And at the same time, there's also lots of other ways outside of books. I find I learned so much by following a lot of anti-racist activists on social media like Instagram and Twitter, and that's a great way to like really learn a lot. So here I'll share my screen back. So this is the People School of DC. So if you go to like anti-racism resources. One, there's a whole list of activists to follow online, and just following these people and reading every day. They have these really great lessons about what's going on. This is a really great way to kind of learn at your own pace. There's some really amazing people, and a lot of people like Rachel Cargyle is amazing, where she like creates all these like mini lessons based on her comment sections and interactions she has with people. And it's really really informative. Also, yeah, if you're looking for a book list. So we have a pretty massive. It's all categorized, but a pretty massive list of books. Good places just like anti-racism perspectives from Ibram Kendi, to like white fragility. Lots of great books there. But then if you want to get more detailed, like DC history. There's some really great books as well. Like want to learn about like go-go right now. It's kind of like the forefront of this gentrification battle. So it's really worthwhile to kind of research what go-go, the history of go-go music in DC. So there's a lot of great from different histories to social justice to different movements. So and then here if you want to get more involved. Like DC activism, we have a giant list of organizations. Well, if you want, a lot of lists of alternative, calling police plans. But then, if you want to get tapped into like anti-racism organizations in the area, or if you want to, work on the DC vote, right to vote, environmental, or that's statehood, environmental justice. There's a lot of organizations you can tap into, and there's also if you want to hear about things that are just happening, right now it's kind of hard because a lot of things are just happening outside of social media right now. We try to keep this pretty extensive, all these different like workshops and rallies and trainings and activism and stuff throughout the city, greater DC area, that if you want to get involved with. It's definitely drastically reduced since COVID, but there's still a lot of ways to get involved.
Let's see. And there was also a question earlier about finding like job candidates and figuring out those who had the same sort of beliefs and principles in human rights and food justice. So they're asking how do you find these people? Do you know of any resources for helping to ask legal questions, but try to find good candidates for implementing these sorts of programs?
Yeah, so we do have a lot of resources on that stuff. One of the biggest things that I really liked was here. I'll pull up some of our past presentations. We talked a little bit about this. Here, let me pull that.
I think you're on mute.
Sorry, WebEx. Here, let me pull up a couple resources really quickly. But a lot of this is like incorporating into the hiring practices, like skills that you're looking for, not just like what degree does someone have or what previous hiring experience, but also previous like anti-racism experience. Trying to like find out like what like make that a skill share that you're actually looking for, an experience that you're actually looking for. You're not just looking for a degree, but you're also looking for experiences around anti-racism and anti-racism work. I really like that a lot. But let me pull up a couple of slides real quick from a previous presentation that okay, so this was from our Food Justice 201 class that was part of that urban garden series. So it was very similar. We talked about the food apartheid, but we also got into more about community first approaches and how to actually get more involved with community ownership and things like that. lessons on community convert, understanding diversity versus, equity, and understanding diverse environments don't always ensure equal environments. Gatekeeping, finding, tips on finding, getting funds in the right hands. But so this is the whole slide. If anyone wants to screenshot this slide, but it's from this article called "Fake Equity: Moving Beyond Training," and it talks about how to actually, not only hire more people, how to create, racial equity skills into your interview process, your candidate process, making that, a thing that you're looking for, but also different ways to actually incorporate. But this whole article is a fantastic article. If anyone wants to screen share this, or if you want me, I can share this as well. Yeah, and then I have a lot of other articles. If you want, I can share some of those articles with you, Erica, if you want to pass them around.
Yeah, sure.
Sounds good. Well, cool. Well, thank you all. I'm happy to stick around. If anyone has any more questions, you can unmute yourself. Yeah, I just, like I said, my chat is it's not letting me scroll for some reason. But yeah, I'll stick around for a little while. But yeah, thank you all so much, and I'll definitely send some resources and things to Erica to share around. And thanks to Erica for letting me know. Like I said, this is this helps me when I go through these things, and I'm also looking for feedback too. I know there's a couple critical comments as well. I'm happy, send me an email. I'm happy to talk this out. If you have feedback for this presentation, I appreciate feedback as well. And I'm also happy to have some deeper, longer conversations that we couldn't really have in our short time frame. But yeah, definitely. Yeah, thank you all so much for this opportunity. And yeah, I'll stick around for a couple more minutes. But if I don't see anything else, we'll go ahead and wrap this up.
So I think you may have captured everything.
Okay.
Well, that you can do in such a short amount of time.
I apologize. I mean, I need to figure out how to be more simplistic. I just kind of feel like I just vomit an insane amount of information, and I don't think it's. Yeah, I need to figure out better ways to do it. But yeah, I appreciate everyone for tolerating it. But cool. Well, thank you all so much. This was a really great experience. Thank you all. I'm happy to do more presentations in the future as well. Yeah, I'll send out all the information to Erica to pass around. But yeah, thank you all so much, and definitely stay safe. A lot's happening right now, so take it in stride. Remember, we need long-term warriors, not quick burnout people. So take it in stride, and yeah, appreciate you all. Thanks. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and end this. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Josh.